In this video, I'm going to show you how to use string functions to deal with names when we sometimes have middle initials and sometimes don't. This is some campaign finance data from the year that uh, Al Franken ran for Senate here in Minnesota. And there were a lot of famous people who gave to his campaign, so this makes for a little bit of fun data. But you can see we have Tom J. Hanks, Kevin Kline without a middle initial, etc. So we're going to walk through how to marry several things together to make this work. This requires knowing string functions, including one called len, which calculates the length of a string, and then an if statement. So if you haven't learned how to use if statements yet, you might want to do that first. So what we're going to do first is, this is one of the things that's really important here is that our data needs to be clean and free of leading and trailing spaces. So the first thing we're going to do here is create a new column where we just transfer the original name into a new column but trim all the leading and trailing spaces. So now we have Alexander Jason. It looks exactly the same. The next thing we need to do is deal with suffixes, because my formula here is not going to take that into consideration. If you have a lot of suffixes, you might want to find a mass way to deal with them. But in this case, we only have one. This is a really short data set. We only have one, Alexander Baldwin. And so I'm going to just put his suffix in here, and I'm going to edit his name. And you'll see we still have our formula in here, so I'm going to do copy, paste special values. I like to do it this way so you can see paste special values. Okay, now our formula is gone, and we can delete the suffix from there. Now we have the suffix in a new field, which we can kind of tuck in there. So then the last name is a pretty easy one to do. What we want to do is use the left function till it starts on the left and go until it finds a comma. Notice that the comma falls at a different byte position on each one, so we need to use the search function to tell it to go find the comma. And so if you remember, in a basic left function, we tell it what cell to do its work on and then how many bytes to go. And in this case, instead of giving it a hard number like 5 or 6 or whatever, we're going to tell it go find the comma. That's what this part is, search, and then the two arguments are what you're looking for, in quotes, that would be a comma, and then a comma outside that quote marks, and then what cell to do its work on. And yes, we're repeating what cell to do the work on twice, but this function needs its own reminder of which cell to do its work in. This first H2 is telling the left function what cell to do its work on. Now there's a little strange thing here on the end, -1. I'm going to take that off first and show you what happens without it. So if we do this, we get Alexander comma. So what happens is the search function goes to the comma and includes the comma. So we don't want that. To tell it to exclude the comma, after the search part is all done, but before the last parenthesis, we're going to put -1. I'm going to put a little space in here just so you can see. You don't need the spaces, but you can see it. And what that's going to do is ignore that. It's going to take a step back, 1 byte back, and effectively leaving out the comma. Look at that, nice and clean. So now for the rest of the name, this one's a bit more hinky. So I'm going to take a couple things off here so you can see how this works. So we need to tell it to start in the middle of the cell this time, H2 again, and again go find the comma. And remember, this time we need to do the opposite. We need to do +1 to tell it to go past the comma. And then mid needs a third argument, which is how many bytes to take. Excel doesn't have any way to tell it, just go to the end of the cell. There's no way to do that. So the simplest thing is to give it a big fat number that you know is going to be more than big enough to capture every possible name here. I usually just put in 100. Now if we run this, look what happens here. We can capture that leading space that was between the comma and the name. So we can fix that by adding a trim around the whole thing, all the way around it with a bracket at the very end. And now we've got rid of that leading space. So now we still have first names and middle initials all in the same column, but from here on out we're going to do our work just on this column on K2. So the main trick to figuring out the middle initial is to figure out if to take the length of the bytes in that cell and subtract 1 and see if there's a space in there. So if we just do a simple length, a len on K2, we can see that Jason is 5 bytes. And then we can see here, Lucille F is 9 bytes. So the thing we're going to try to figure out is if byte number 8 is a space or not. And I did this just to show you how len works. It just returns a number showing the length of everything in the cell, and you can see that all of them are different from each other. So now let's do another little test here to show you how this might work. What we want to do is use an if statement, and in the middle of the if statement is this part right here is the criteria. It's saying go in the middle of K2, figure out the length of K2 and subtract 1. So figure out the length of K2 and subtract 1, and then that's the starting place, and then just take 1 byte. So in this case, like in that Lucille F example, that's going to find byte 8. That's what we want it to find. And it's going to look and see, is that a space? So quote, space, quote. And then if that's true, it's going to drop the word true in our column here. And if it's false, it's going to drop the word false. So this is just a test. Yep, Jason doesn't have a middle initial. But look at here, Tom J. Yep, it is true. Lucille F is true. Alexander R is true. It's working. So that's the crux part of our formula. And again, this is just a test to show you how that works. Now, to get the middle then, we're going to take that same formula, but instead of the true and the false, we're going to tell it to use the right function and grab the rightmost character if there is a middle initial. If there is not, it's just going to leave it blank, and that's what this quote, quote at the end does. So recall if statements, this is the criteria part of our if statement. This is what to do if it's true, and then just leave it blank if it's false. So we should get little letters next to all these ones that were true. Yay! Middle initials. So then we're left with the first name, and again we need to evaluate whether or not there's a middle initial so we can deal with it accordingly. But this time we're going to, if there is a middle initial, we're going to tell it to skip that middle initial, go back. That's what this len K2 minus 1 does. Otherwise, if there is no middle initial, just take all of K2, and I threw a trim in here just for good measure. And so we should get, there we go, Tom, Lucille, Alexander, no middle initial. There are written directions for this as well next to this video that will probably help you out a lot here. There's a lot to digest. Good luck.